The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
As someone who enjoys trying out different makeup looks but doesn't wear a ton on a daily basis, I like to focus on making sure I have high quality staples. And regardless of your makeup routine, you've probably seen Thrive Cosmetics Viral Tubing Mascara. I've certainly seen it everywhere. It's in that turquoise tube and it's become my go-to for mascara because it doesn't clump or smudge and it comes off really easily with just water. So that mascara, along with all of Thrive Cosmetics beauty products, are certified 100% vegan and cruelty-free. Their bestsellers have thousands of 5-star reviews, and it's easy to see why. Their products are great. I love a multi-purpose makeup product, and their brilliant eye brightener is perfect to use as eyeliner, eyeshadow, even highlighter. I'd recommend using shade Stella for that. They all have a shimmer, and Stella is this really pretty champagne color that looks great on a variety of skin tones. Something I also didn't know from all the mascara videos I saw is that for every product sold, Thrive Cosmetics donates either that same product, another product that's needed more, or a monetary donation towards 8 major causes, including those impacted by cancer, domestic abuse, and veteran and education organizations. So refresh your everyday look with Thrive Cosmetics. It's beauty that gives back. Right now, you can get an exclusive 20% off your first order at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/thrive for 20% off your first order.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and by popular demand, which is largely just me excitedly messaging EK and asking her to be on the podcast, my guest today is the iconic EK McAlpine, who you may know from her reels on Instagram. Her account is called It's Like History, and she does hilarious reels, especially during the Mary Queen of Scots season. I was resharing almost every one of them because she's done a lot about Margaret Tudor, Marie de Guise, Mary Queen of Scots, the Tudors. She's been recently recording her reaction as she watches the Tudors, the TV series. She also, the very first time that I found out about her was one of the listeners sent me one of her reels and was like, I thought this was you for a minute. And I'm like, oh, I also thought that was me for a minute, because she and I are both glasses wearing white people of Scottish heritage with long red hair. Anyway, I did take a picture of her and I recording to prove that we are not the same person. I don't just put on an accent and make reels. We're very different people. And EK's person, like the person of her heart, is Saint Margaret, who is the a real person. I guess all saints are real people, but we're talking about Saint Margaret of Scotland, aka Margaret of Wessex. I just wanted to say, like, we're talking about her life, and then eventually she was named a saint after the fact. So she's a person who is known as Saint Margaret of Scotland, also Margaret of Wessex. Her story is international. Born in Hungary, she's an English princess. She ends up going to Scotland, and it's a real different story from other foreign-born people we've heard about coming into Scotland. This is pre-Scottish asshole lords era. She actually did really well for herself. I was so excited to have EK on the show. We had the most fun recording. Could have talked to her forever. And I mean, basically, just like enjoy. So I'm joined today by my doppelganger, EK McAlpine. Welcome, EK.
Hello, I'm your cross-Atlantic counterpart. And technically, we will never have been in the same room. So could we still be one person?
Could it be one person changing accents, asking themselves questions? Entirely possible.
It could be.
I'm such a fan. I'm so excited you're here. And you're here to talk about the person of whom I think you are the biggest fan.
Yeah.
Which is Saint Margaret, or do we call her Margaret of Scotland?
Wow, there are so many Margarets of Scotland. Kind of because of St. Margaret, it ended up becoming a really common, popular name. So, and technically, like, she is Margaret of Scotland, but she's also Margaret of England because she was not Scottish. But won't spoil it too much.
But if we go with Saint Margaret, that's just her. Well, there's probably other Saint Margarets, but at least there's probably less Saint Margarets than there are Margarets of Scotland.
Yeah, and I think in Scotland, when most people, when they hear St. Margaret, they would assume they're St. Margaret. Outside of Scotland, like, she is somewhat known, but I had never heard of her, as I will elaborate on later, her having some links to kind of where I'm from. But it wasn't until I had started studying Scottish history in Scotland that somebody was like, hey, have you heard of this woman? And I was like, no, but I am prepared to become obsessed.
Well, let's begin there. Like, what was that introduction to her like? How did the obsession begin?
It was twofold, and I didn't realize that the first bit had happened until the second bit. My best friend lives in Edinburgh, and we became best friends. And then I, visited her pretty regularly, and we've done like lots of the history tourism. And we went to Edinburgh Castle, obviously, which is incredible. Highly recommend. There is a chapel dedicated to her in Edinburgh Castle. It's very, very small and very quiet, but it is the oldest building in the entire city. And so I'd kind of heard vaguely that there was this woman called St. Margaret who was famous. And then there was a book sale on Palgrave Macmillan, which is one of the big publishers. And my best friend got me this book, which is called St. Margaret, Queen of the Scots, A Life in Perspective. It's basically like an academic monograph. I think it's taken from the woman's PhD thesis. So I'd kind of heard of her vaguely. And then when I started doing my master's degree in Edinburgh about medieval Scotland, on one of my first courses, it was to do with medieval sources. There were loads of different options you could take. And I took one on medieval narratives. And we looked at a few things, but one of the things we looked at was St. Margaret's biography that was written in the medieval period. And I was like, oh, I'll write it about her. And then kind of remembered like, oh, I already have that book about her. And I kind of vaguely know who she is. And it was a really interesting class. And I think Margaret kind of primed for how I then ended up like throughout my entire master's degree, because I wrote another paper. I wrote 2 papers about her in total. And like she and studying her, the sources around her, I think taught me a lot about how I approach history kind of thing. So she's had kind of a big impact then. And I did in both of the essays that I wrote on her, I did well. So, and I did promise when it was the second one and I was waiting for the result, I was like, so Margaret, I'm rapping you the hardest on the earthly plane right now. If you can hook a girl up with a decent grade, I'll come and visit your shrine. And she did, and I did. But I'm very much like, I'm out here representing you, Margaret. It's been a long time since you were alive. I'm doing the best I can.
Is she, I mean, we're going to talk about her life story and stuff, but like as a saint, is she the saint of a certain thing?
Scotland.
She's the saint of Scotland.
So it's obviously St. Andrew is kind of the big name patron saint of Scotland. But I think now we very much see saints and all kind of stuff to do with sanctity is very fixed. So like one of the books I've been reading, doing research about saint stuff kind of more generally, it was talking about medieval saints, and it was like whenever we as historians come to something about medieval saints, we always for some reason go by like what now is the criteria for becoming a saint. The writer was like, why do we do this? It doesn't make any sense. Like we wouldn't do it in any other situation. Because like the papal rules, the idea that the papacy was the only people allowed to grant sainthood is a 12th century thing, which was like Margaret was a papal canonization stamp of approval. But the idea of like one person being the patron saint of one thing is quite like new. It's quite a modern thing. So there's obviously St. Andrew is considered in the UK like the official patron saint of Scotland, but Margaret is also very much, even though it's not like on the Wikipedia page, she's still kind of a big one. And I think like Andrew never went to Scotland. Like I think I want to say he was in Turkey, what is now modern day Turkey, and his bones ended up in Scotland, but he never went. So I think
He doesn't
Margaret
deserve that. No.
Margaret went. She like ruled that country, and you're telling me she has to be the secondary one? Absolutely disgraceful.
Sexism, the patriarchy.
Even though she was kind of a fan of St. Andrew, so maybe she'd be like, oh, fine.
She is a saint. I'm sure she'd be like,
yeah,
very forgiving. I was just looking at, I have this massive spreadsheet of like every woman I've ever talked about on this podcast, and I'm just like, where does she fit? And she fits like right in the middle of nobody I've ever talked about.
Yeah, she's just not outside of Scotland. She's really, and even inside of Scotland, I don't think people know like all about her story. Like it's not common knowledge, but it's pub quiz knowledge. That if you went to a pub quiz in Scotland and there was a question about like what was the name of the Queen of Scots, blah blah blah, who is now a saint, people would be like, oh, it's probably Margaret in it.
What I'll say is that she was born in, I believe, 1045, which is about 50 years before Empress Matilda, who we've talked about on the podcast. And there's a connection there, right?
Yes. Empress Matilda is Margaret's granddaughter.
Right. Okay. So there's that connection. I'm just like, for the listeners, like if you, or for me, honestly, just so I can cling to like, is this connected to any story I've ever read before? That one. Okay. Great. And there's also that whole period. I don't know, that whole period, it's like everyone is called Matilda for a while, and I just get really confused.
Wow, there's a reason for that. That not that everyone gets called Matilda, but the impact that Margaret has on like Empress Matilda, and then the rest of English history is huge. And so I think listeners will be like, oh, so that was because of that. Margaret very much was that kind of almost like a sliding doors moment, where even though in her life, like I always say, the most interesting, sorry to Margaret for this, but the most interesting and exciting stuff happens after she dies. And yeah, like she's very much the beginning domino as it goes down.
Well, that's exciting because we have talked at length on this podcast about the Mary Queen of Scots scenario, and we've gotten a lot into Scottish history. So it's nice to take a step back and like much earlier Scottish history. So you know what? This is your girl. So like take it away. Tell her story. Who is she? Where was she born? Who are her parents? What's the situation?
So she's born in Hungary, or what is now Hungary.
Okay, that's surprising to me already.
Yeah. So, but the kind of situation, the preamble for that is happening in England at the time of her birth, which is around 1045. Edward the Confessor is King of England. He's been the king since 1042. And he is a distant descendant of the 9th century King Alfred the Great, who is the only English monarch to get the epithet the Great. And Alfred the Great was part of kind of like the royal house of Wessex.
Oh, I know it was that Ethelfled was his
Yes,
daughter. We
yeah,
talked about Ethelfled on the podcast. Okay, another
she's
connection. Yeah.
iconic. She's
Oh my God.
iconic.
Yeah.
And so what was then Wessex, we now kind of call the West Country these days, and that is where I live. So that's kind of my little connection to Margaret as well. So Edward the Confessor is married to a woman called Edith of Wessex, but they've not had any children. And so Edward is he's scouting, he's ready to recruit for another heir for his successor. And so he invites his nephew to court. This nephew is called Edward. There are a lot of Edwards in
Oh
this
God. Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
But conveniently, a lot of them seem to have nicknames. So we've got Edward the Confessor, and then his nephew is Edward the Exile. So see if you can guess what happened to him. So he was the son of a king called Edmund Ironside, who was the half brother of Edward the Confessor. King Canute, who was a Danish, I think he was king of Denmark and king of Norway. I don't know where he was from, but he seizes the throne of England in 1016, and Edward the Exile, and he has a brother called Edmund. They are sent away. They're kind of exiled by Canute. And there's like disagreement as to how and why this happened. But the vibe you get from a lot of the chronicles is that Canute kind of was hoping that they would be murdered after leaving England. But for whatever reason, that did not happen. And they end up escaping to Hungary. Edward the Exile's brother, Edmund, dies, leaving Edward, who kind of makes a life for himself in Hungary. He marries a woman of very mysterious lineage called Agatha. And by mysterious lineage, like nobody can agree on who she was related to. The academic monograph that I will mention several times by Catherine Keane, she has an entire chapter to it. And then there's like a biography of her written by an academic. And it like the writer just gives up. He's like, I have no idea who this person is related to. There's a quote they said, Agatha was arguably the daughter of King Stephen of Hungary, or of Bruno, brother of the German Emperor Henry II, or of a half brother of the Emperor Henry III, or of none of them. So nobody knows where this woman has appeared from. But wherever she is from, she has 3 children with Edward. She has a daughter called Christina, who is born around 1040. Margaret is born around 1045. And then Agatha and Edward have a son called Edgar, who is born around 1051.
Can I just pause to appreciate the fact that in the middle of all these people who are called Edgar and Edward, Christina?
I don't know a huge amount about like Central Eastern European history in this point. I think possibly it was maybe a popular name in that period.
I love it. I mean, everyone else's names are just blurring for me, and there's just mound of like names starting with A and E and AE, Christina. Yeah, I'll remember her. Yeah.
Yeah, Christina, and then Margaret. There's lots of debate about why Margaret was named Margaret. There could be lots of reasons. But then, those 3. And like in the story, they are the only 3 with those names, Edgar, Christina, and Margaret, that are like completely related to this. So thank you to mysterious Agatha for giving us this like variety, but also sorry that nobody knows who you are. So sorry about that, babes. In 1057, Edward the Exile, he's been invited by Edward the Confessor, and so he returns to England with all of his family. And it's kind of assumed that Edward the Confessor was then kind of going to kind of groom Edward the Exile kind of for the throne as his successor. And that might have worked, except Edward the Exile immediately dies after they arrive in England. Like immediately. So it's like, oh no, what do we do now? And there's nowhere else for the family to go. So they end up staying in England. And Margaret and Christina spend a fair amount of time hanging out in the West Country, or Wessex as it was once called, which is where I am. And even though their kind of family situation is kind of precarious, they would have still had kind of a privileged, nice upbringing. Their royal status was clearly recognized, but none of them, like Edgar or the girls, they're not given like any lands. And so they don't really have much economic power or independent means. Catherine Keane reckons that Margaret and Christina were educated at Wilton Abbey, and Edward the Confessor's wife, Edith of Wessex, had been educated there, and she had the abbey. It was built in wood and she had it rebuilt into stone. Edith of Wessex she was quite controversial. Like, she kept beefing with people. She had a disagreement with a monastery because she kept kind of relieving various religious houses of like their most important relics. So she was a little bit controversial. But Wilton Abbey there was like a really large network of female religious centres in this part of the world in this era. And I'd love to do more research into that. So there's Wilton, Shaftesbury Abbey, which is now in ruins, and then Amesbury Abbey and Romsey Abbey. Romsey Abbey comes up again later. Most of these haven't survived. Romsey does have, it's like there is a parish church, which is still there and you can go visit, but all of like the abbey buildings are gone. And then Wilton Abbey is also gone. I think there's like a few bricks left, but there's like a huge stately home was built on top of it. But also built on top of it was an adventure playground. Not at the time, obviously. This is a recent thing.
Okay.
So, I mean, like, sorry about the Reformation and all that. Henry VIII, you got your divorce, and I got entire afternoons of my childhood careening about. So I will allow them to have Wilton Abbey.
Well, and I like that she was there as a child being educated and you were there as a child.
Exactly.
Playing, it's got a really youthful energy.
Yeah. She was looking down being like, oh, this random girl. Great things are in her future. My biggest memory of that adventure playground is they had like stepping stones, but the stepping stones turned really fast. And me and my sister were there with our grandmother, and she wasn't quite looking while we were on these. And like, I have no idea how we survived it. It was so dangerous. And we had to agree not to tell our grandmother because if she found out, she'd be cross with us. So they were too dangerous. So we kind of had to just like play it off like, oh, it was fine. It wasn't fine. It was scary. But yeah, Margaret she wasn't doing too much of that, but she was definitely spending kind of her formative years in these religious houses that were very much associated or like patronized or founded by royal and noble women.
I'm assuming, based on your knowledge of saints and things, how long had Christianity been there in England?
So in England, I absolutely should know this.
I'm going to say, I'm going to guess something like 500 years. I'm just looking at my handy chart.
I know that. Yeah, probably.
Brunhild of Austrasia was the person who funded the first missionary. And that was somewhere around the year like 600. So
yeah, the gap in my knowledge is that Margaret is like the earliest I've studied. So I risk sometimes coming at it from this like of somebody who's mainly in kind of 15th and 16th century Scotland.
Yeah.
But yeah, so England is like a Christian country at this point. So is Scotland and Ireland. Ireland's Christianity predates slightly England, and then in Scottish Christianity at this point was a little bit more of like the Irish flavour. But that comes up later, actually, because Margaret, she had ideas, and some of the controversy around her is about those ideas. But I mean, and there were like royal female saints at this point. So Edith of Wessex was obviously like a matriarch in Margaret's life. But then there's Edith of Wilton, who was a few hundred years before, who was at Wilton Abbey. And then Edith of Wessex was quite a big fan of Edith of Wilton, who was a princess. So there's kind of it's like this is not like a legend, but like this is how royal women act in terms of their religious devotion that's being kind of passed down through the like centuries and generations. And now Margaret is kind of receiving that as well. So like Catherine Keane talks about like what languages she might have learned in this period, because the royal family of England was very multilingual at this point. So Edith of Wessex, she spoke English, but also French and Danish. And Edward the Confessor, he spent a lot of his childhood in Normandy. And so he was fluent in Norman French and might have had like a little bit of a Norman French accent. So Margaret might have known, she certainly would have known what was then Old English, and almost certainly knew Latin, but she might have spoken a bit of Danish and French as well. So that's exciting for her. She's living her best life. She's educated. She's learning about piety. She's learning from all these other women. And then in 1066, Edward the Confessor dies. So Margaret's younger brother Edgar had been given the title Etheling, which is one of the AE words, and it just means like king-worthy. And there were some nobles in England who were like, we want you to succeed Edward the Confessor. But at this point, Edgar is like a teenager, which puts you at kind of a disadvantage when you are trying to seize a kingdom. So the kind of real contenders for the throne at this point is Edith of Wessex's brother, Harold Godwinson, and Duke William of Normandy. And obviously William defeats Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And William is then crowned on Christmas Day of that year.
Oh, wait. So this is, I'm putting pieces together. William the Conqueror, yes?
Yes, yeah.
That's this. Okay, the Norman invasion. This is okay.
This is the Norman
These are
conquest.
phrases I've heard, and you're putting them in context. Thank you.
Yeah, 1066 is something that most like children in it, maybe not children, but like teenagers, you learn about it at school over here. For 1066 is like the big year, and I'm sure you've seen bits of the Bayeux Tapestry. And when I was in secondary school, we did a trip to France and we went and saw the Bayeux Tapestry. And I was like 13 and I did not understand how important it was. I did not appreciate it in any way. And so now, as the person I am today, I'm like yelling at 13-year-old EK and being like, show it some respect. It's really important. Whereas at the time I was just like, ugh, this is so boring. But there we are. So William, he's come, he seized the throne, he has kind of a complicated relationship with Margaret and her siblings. They are treated well and like they're brought into the king's peace. But it's very clear that William is aware that Edgar potentially has a claim. And there's a point the next year in 1067, William kind of nips over to Normandy and Edgar is one of the nobles kind of chosen or perhaps compelled to accompany him. Like Edgar still could be a bit of a threat. William is kind of in a difficult situation. He can't really dismiss Edgar's claim because Edgar's claim comes from the House of Wessex and comes from the fact that Edgar is related to the previous king, Edward the Confessor. Because even though William, he is William the Conqueror, he has established his right to the throne by conquest, William is also kind of bolstering his claim to the throne by the fact that he is also kind of related to Edward the Confessor. So Edward the Confessor's mother was William's great aunt. So if William kind of diminishes and dismisses the importance of like Edgar, Margaret and Christina's relationship to Edward the Confessor, it risks kind of discrediting his own, like it will be cutting off his nose to spite his face somewhat. And so initially there's a peace and William is treating certainly the children and Agatha, I assume, with respect. But the Norman conquest, it happens it can seem from the south of England to have happened very quickly. But actually there was huge opposition to the Normans in the north, and eventually Edgar becomes involved in this resistance. And so in 1068, her family, so Margaret, Christina, Edgar, and Agatha, they flee north and they end up in Scotland, where they meet with Malcolm III, who was the King of Scots. And then Malcolm has a very interesting background. His father, Duncan, was killed by Macbeth.
Oh my God, I was just saying, those are the names from Macbeth.
Yes.
Duncan, Malcolm.
Macbeth.
Literal Macbeth. Okay.
Like the Shakespeare plays, I don't think is pretty much devoid of historical accuracy, but it was one of my favorites at school. So I was really excited about this. I was like, it's that Duncan, like that actual Duncan. So because Macbeth has killed Malcolm's father, Duncan, Malcolm spent some of his kind of adolescence also in exile at the English royal court when Edward the Confessor was still alive. So he might have met either Margaret, Christina, or Edgar, but I don't think it's like I don't think anyone suggests they did meet, but they may well have done, like they were both in England at the same time. But in 1054, when Edward the Confessor is still alive, obviously, he funds a campaign to invade Scotland, led by an earl from Northumbria. And the plan is to kind of overthrow Macbeth and install Malcolm as a king.
I can't believe that Macbeth is a person.
I know.
He's in the story.
There's some there are some elements of like the way Macbeth was defeated in battle. Like you can see where Shakespeare was taking inspiration from, where you're like, oh yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense. But having knowledge of the plot of Macbeth did not help me to understand, unfortunately, all of the stuff that happened. And so Malcolm and his mate, the Earl of Northumbria, defeat Macbeth militarily, but he kind of stays on the scene until 1057. Malcolm then kills Macbeth. Macbeth has a stepson who rules for like 5 minutes. Malcolm then kills the stepson. So finally, in 1058, Malcolm has now been crowned king. So, love that for him. And then in 1068, Margaret and her family turn up. And there's some debate about whether Margaret and her family were trying to get to Scotland or if they were possibly trying to return to like continental Europe, that ended up being kind of wrecked off the Scottish coast. Either way, however they get there, they get there. And it is agreed that Margaret will marry Malcolm. And her biographer, Catherine Keane, says, I think sums it up quite well, as this is where Margaret firmly enters the historical record through her marriage to Malcolm, King of the Scots. And we kind of have to take a step back and momentarily consider what that historical record means, because one of the key texts we have that focuses on Margaret's life is written by a monk named Turgot just after she dies. So she dies in 1093, and then in the early 1100s, he writes this biography of her. And Turgot is, when I was going through my notes for this, I was like slagging Turgot off about how boring he was and how annoying I found him. But then I was going over like his biography and I was like, oh, sorry, babes, like you were quite interesting. So sorry to him. He's from Lincolnshire in England, and like at some point he gets held hostage at Lincoln Castle by the Normans. He then bribes somebody to escape, ends up in Norway for a bit and just like hangs out with the royal court in Norway. And he's been interested in like, oh, maybe I should become a monk, but nothing ever really happened. And then when he's coming back from Norway to England, his ship sinks and he like loses all his stuff. And he's like, oh, guess this is a sign, I better become a monk. Which is like, okay, I bet you had some stories to tell. He actually beefs a little bit with Malcolm III at an early point in this, because Turgot is trying to set up a religious community at Melrose in Scotland, and Malcolm like doesn't want to allow them to do this, because Turgot and kind of his mates won't swear fealty to Malcolm. So there's that kind of like friction. But then in the 1080s, Turgot becomes part of the community at Durham, and Malcolm is a big fan of Durham, and Margaret is a big fan. So they, patch things up eventually. But the text that Turgot writes about Margaret is a spiritual biography that's called a Vita, which is just Latin for life. So sometimes you will hear the book called like The Life of St. Margaret. And these texts are explicitly written to promote a case for canonization. It's emphasizing how pious she is, how holy, and she's got sanctity coming out of her ears. This is a whole genre called hagiography that is preparing someone's legacy for hopefully they will be venerated and then eventually canonized. And Turgot's work isn't the only source that we have for Margaret. So there's like some charters, there's a few letters that Margaret wrote. And she also appears in some of the versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which like, you ain't special. Everybody was. So it's lucky for Margaret that she had Turgot, because like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is so full of stuff that I would understand if she slipped through the cracks. But Turgot's is definitely, it's very detailed and is apparently taken from first-hand experience. He's always hyping up about like, oh, the fun we had together. Like, I remember when she told me about this, and oh, wasn't she amazing when I saw her do this? And as a result, his work is like the most influential on kind of her legacy and how her life, her afterlife and how that shapes out. But like, we have to take, as we do with all historical sources, but with Turgot's work, we have to take it with like a wheelbarrow of salt, because he wants Margaret to be canonized. Like that is the entire reason for this. So he spends a long time, kind of like pages and pages, outlining the ancestry of Margaret, her paternal ancestry. The maternal ancestry stuff is, as we've said, very complicated because we don't know who Agatha is. And then Turgot mentions about Edward the Exile, who's invited over to England. And then finally, Margaret kind of appears centre stage when she is married to Malcolm. And in this scene, Turgot says that that Margaret did not want to marry Malcolm and that she didn't want to marry anyone. And he says that her brother Edgar only consented to the match because he was kind of harangued into it. He writes that Edgar was, quote, surrendering her more by the will of his people than by his own, or rather by the decree of God. And it may be that that's how it happened, but I think like a good jumping off point of how you need to be suspicious of Turgot is he wants her to be canonized, and what better way to hype up her holiness than by portraying her as like, oh, she didn't want to get married, she wanted to be a nun. And then the other kind of more practical skepticism on this kind of incident is, even though obviously the fortunes of her family had been really up and down, Margaret had been raised in royal courts as a princess. She was the daughter and the sister of would-be kings, even though none of that really panned out. But I think she would have known that she would be expected to marry according to her status and also kind of the political strategies of her family. So even though Malcolm had kind of been installed on the throne of Scotland by Edward the Confessor, and Edward the Confessor at that point wanted Malcolm to kind of rule according to English interests, that didn't last. That didn't stick. Malcolm kind of said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. And so Malcolm is constantly beefing with England. And after the Norman Conquest, when it's the William the Conqueror, it makes sense for Edgar and for Malcolm that the two would want to ally, because Edgar's family are now in opposition to the current English king. Malcolm is just in opposition to England when it suits him. So their alliance makes complete sense. Like I would understand why that marriage would happen. And as I said, we can't say, oh, Margaret was definitely really happy to marry if Turgot is kind of protesting too much. But I think Margaret would have kind of been reconciled to it eventually.
Do you know how old she was when she was married?
So they probably got married around 1070, and if she's probably born around 1045, then she would have been about 25.
Okay, so like an adult aged person.
Yeah. So she and Malcolm was possibly slightly older than her, but I don't think, obviously she was 25, so she was considered very much of the age to marry. And the fact that she was a little bit older, you might be like, well, why hadn't she been married sooner? But I think because things were just so up and down for her family, like an alliance that they made at one point might not stick to the next. So I think it was quite like an eventful and unsettled time. So if obviously she wasn't married until she was 25, maybe that did mean that she wanted to enter the church. But I just think it's always kind of given as if it's like 100% true, like, oh no, she never wanted to get married. And she may not have, but I just think Turgot, I'm like, do I trust you? Even though you had an exciting life and bribed your way out of captivity. I can be impressed by him, but that doesn't mean I have to believe him. That's life advice, my goodness.
Yeah.
So now we kind of can think about Turgot's role in all of this, and kind of apply that skepticism to his wider portrayal of Margaret. Obviously, describing her as really pious, and there's that kind of classical medieval hyperbole where it's like so extreme, everything she does. But the way Turgot presents, like the way he chooses to represent her religious devotion is very interesting. So he bigs up her involvement massively in the reform of the Scottish church. So as we said earlier, the Scottish church had like developed on a slightly different line to in England, and was more influenced by kind of Irish Christianity. And the way Turgot tells it, Margaret is pushing the Church of Scotland more towards like the way the papacy wants you to do it. So she says like, oh, you're not fasting long enough for Lent. oh, why aren't you taking the Eucharist at Easter? Like, you're meant to do this, you're meant to do that. And she's quite bossy, I would say, in this. And she like does not brook any opposition. And sometimes you will get criticisms of her written like today as her being kind of quite tyrannical. But then you also get the opposite, where people are like, oh, well, surely she wouldn't have been that aggressive and bossy. So it must be that she wasn't actually that involved. I would say, as is often the case, the truth is probably somewhere down the middle. But when you're thinking about how Turgot is presenting it, Turgot himself was very keen on reform of the church. And so he's quite happy to portray Margaret as basically agreeing with how Turgot thinks it should be done. Like, how convenient is that? That Margaret just happens to agree with all kind of like the changes that you think should happen to the church is also how you think they should happen. Like, that's very convenient. And then Turgot's portrayal, which kind of ties into all of this, the way he portrays Malcolm, because he portrays Malcolm, and I would put serious money betting that no one could come up with a more accurate description of Malcolm as he's a himbo. He is full on golden retriever boyfriend. Like, apparently he can't read, but because Margaret loves books, he loves the books. And the books, I think Turgot writes, that which she had rejected, he likewise rejected, and that which she had loved, he loved for the love of her love. Wherefore the books with which she was accustomed either to pray or to read, this man, although illiterate, was accustomed to lead through by hand and to inspect. And when he had heard from her which of them was dearer, this he chose to consider more dearly, and often kissed and handled. Which, like, there's a few modern illustrations of Malcolm and Margaret in like this romantic kind of forest glen, and she's reading to him, and he might as well just have like big heart eyes. Like, I don't want to say like, oh, it's an emasculating portrayal. I think the motivation behind Turgot showing Malcolm as just like a big himbo who is just a golden retriever is, I think that Turgot struggled to fit Margaret into existing models of what sainthood among women should look like. I think he had kind of a couple of models to consider, and he tried to cobble together a few of them. So the kind of big example of female sanctity in this era is the Virgin Martyr model. It was incredibly popular in the medieval period, especially in the later medieval. But most of the stories about it were from the early medieval period. And basically, virgin martyr saints do what they say on the tin. Christianity is kind of overflowing with these stories of young women, and they are always beautiful, they're always young, they're always super, super Christian, and they love Jesus. And then there will be like another figure who is always male, often non-Christian, and sometimes it's the girl's father or their husband or like a potential spouse who really fancies her. And this like pagan spouse or whatever says, no, you can't be Christian anymore, you need to convert. She says no, and then the kind of too long didn't read is that she is then executed, usually in an incredibly gory manner, usually doing a few miracles before or during her execution. And this was the most popular model for female saints in this period. But Margaret isn't a martyr and she isn't a virgin. So I think Turgot is like, well, what do I do? And so the way he portrays Malcolm is to kind of try, if Turgot can't make Margaret a virgin or a martyr, he can at least make Malcolm one of these kind of pagan spouses. Except he's struggling with that too, because Malcolm is a Christian. So, and he's not asking Margaret to convert from Christianity. So I think Turgot adopts kind of a dynamic where Malcolm's Christianity was less refined than Margaret's. And that instead of Margaret like converting her husband, she is reforming and refining the church as it was in Scotland. That is why I think Malcolm is a himbo. He needed to be less sophisticated, and he needed to need Margaret's kind of evangelizing presence. So we get this emphasis on like, oh, he's illiterate, he's not educated. Turgot kind of forces Malcolm into this pagan spouse role so that Margaret's sanctity is easier to swallow. And another kind of element of the Virgin Martyr legend is where the woman in question speaks like so eloquently and so persuasively in defense of her faith that she ends up converting some people. And when you look at the passages that Turgot has of Margaret speaking to the clergy about, like, you know, we're not celebrating Lent properly and you need to do this and you need to do that, she is arguing really persuasively, and all of the like clergy that she's speaking to are like, oh my God, she's amazing. And that's something you get in Virgin Martyr stories as well. Catherine of Alexandria is the big one, where like the emperor assembles 50 of the wisest scholars and to argue with her, and she manages to persuade them all that she's actually right. Like, it's very like extreme. There's lots of hyperbole. Like, it is very, and then everybody clapped. That is like the vibe. And so I think Margaret is getting that treatment as well. And you also see Turgot kind of struggling to show how Margaret existed in relation to secular power. So we've got lots of royal women in Europe who chose to enter a life of religious seclusion, especially after being widowed. So Edith of Wessex, Ella, who was the Countess of Salisbury, and then there's Radegund of Poitiers, which is like 6th century. But she was queen.
We know about Radegund on this podcast. Don't worry about it.
Which Radegund? There's a few Radegunds. Is this the Radegund who she became a nun even though her husband was still alive?
Yeah, and then she was sort of like the queen, but like from the convent.
Yes. Yeah. Iconic. Yeah. She's so fun. I did an essay about her in terms of queer history, and it was called Queerism Fuck You. And I basically argued that Radegund can be considered queer in this very elaborate structure of what that meant that I wrote. And it was the best name I came up with through all of my time at university. So, but Margaret doesn't really fit into like Radegund and Edith of Wessex because she was only a widow for about 3 days, and she was a very active queen. So you kind of you get the sense of Turgot being a little bit insecure, as like, because he tries to picture as like, oh well, she only wore fine things because she had to as a queen. I think he got kind of stuck with these models, and his solution was like, okay, well, she had kids, she was married, she didn't disengage herself from kind of secular power. How do I square this circle? And I think that's why we get that portrayal. But then, as I mentioned earlier, he spends a long time talking about her ancestry. And this is kind of the second, and I think the lasting importance to Margaret's story. And it takes place after she dies. So she dies in 1093 at the age of around 53. And she dies, her husband and her eldest son are killed at the Battle of Alnwick. She is given the news, and she's like, oh, okay, gives a lot of deathbed advice, has lots of prayer, understandably, and then she also dies. And then what happens after, because it's not just her that's died, the king has died, and the king's son and presumable heir has also died. Because the problem is, Malcolm had been married before he married Margaret to a woman called Ingeborg Finnsdotter.
Whoa, okay, she was Scandinavian.
Yes. So she's pretty mysterious. We know that she was married once, and presumably by her surname Finnsdotter, she was presumably the daughter of somebody with the name Finn. And there's debate over whether or not Ingeborg had died by the time Malcolm married Margaret. Catherine Keene says she reckons that Ingeborg was set aside, and perhaps on the grounds of consanguinity, which is obviously that old faithful that comes out when you don't want to be married anymore and you say, oh, we're related. And they were related, but somehow it didn't matter when you got married, did it? How convenient. But it could have been that Malcolm and Ingeborg's marriage was kind of like a common law thing, and so it wouldn't have actually mattered whether or not Ingeborg was alive or not by the time Malcolm married Margaret. But Ingeborg has had sons with Malcolm, who are obviously older than the sons, any children with Margaret. The sons are called Duncan and Donald. So Malcolm has a brother He has 2 older children with Ingeborg, and he has 8 children, including 6 sons with Margaret. Now, at this time, like, primogeniture had begun to like settle down. But I do think that our history, like with the Tudors and Henry VIII's obsession with the succession, has made us overestimate it a little. So even though it was a thing that the eldest son probably had rights over the youngest, might can still triumph right at this point. So it's not any of Malcolm's sons that succeeds to the throne at first. It is his brother, Donald, who comes to the throne as Donald III. Donald is then supplanted by Ingeborg's son, Duncan, with the assistance of one of Margaret's sons, Edmund. But then brother Donald takes the throne from Donald's nephew, Duncan. There's a lot of D names in this bit. However, 3 years later, Donald, the brother, is overthrown by Margaret's sons with an army that is supported by the new King of England, William II, who is William the Conqueror's son. And Margaret's son, Edgar, takes the throne. He rules until his death in 1107. Edgar doesn't have any children. So the next son, Alexander, rules. He then dies in 1124, and he hasn't had any kids either. So the crown then passes to Margaret's youngest son, David. Some of the other sons that Margaret and Malcolm had, one of them who had helped one of the interlopers, we're not 100% sure what happened to him, but he might have been like kind of locked in a dungeon and the key thrown away. Another one of the sons joined the church. Yeah, and then the eldest son obviously died at the same time as Malcolm.
So let's just keep track. So like 3 of her sons became King of Scots.
Yeah, one after the other. So Edgar, Alexander, and then David. Edgar and Alexander, bless them, they do stuff, but David's like, he's the most famous one. But this to me is the moment when Margaret is transformed from like, oh, she was really pious, to one of the most important figures in Scottish history. Because her sons, they then do a lot to buttress her legacy. They expand on a monastic settlement that she set up at Dunfermline, which was where she was married. And they're generally just like big fans of their mother. But it's Margaret's daughter who is like the fulcrum to everything we now know about Margaret. So Margaret, she has 2 daughters, Edith and Mary. Both as children are sent to England to Romsey Abbey, which I mentioned earlier, because Margaret's sister Christina is the abbess there. So that's nice, like a little family reunion. At some point, Edith's name is changed to Matilda. It's kind of, people aren't really sure when this happened or why. I think it's because they were trying to normanize her name. So Edith is kind of like a slightly old Wessex name. And now that the Norman conquest has happened, it's like, let's change it to Matilda to make you more, not necessarily appealing, but to make you assimilate with what has now happened in England. And it clearly works because Edith Matilda, as she is usually known by people studying it from a Scottish perspective, just because it gets too confusing else. In 1101, Edith Matilda marries the King of England, Henry I. Henry I is a son of William the Conqueror, and she is very popular as his queen and very well loved. And Edith Matilda, when she is queen, commissions Turgot to write this biography. And Turgot says in the preamble to the Vita he says that you wish not only to hear but also to view unendingly a written life of your mother the Queen, so that although you little knew the countenance of your mother, you might have fuller notice of her virtues. Edith Matilda didn't know her mother well because she was sent to England as a child. So I do think, I believe that Edith Matilda would like to know her mother better and thus would commission this work. But all the stuff that happened after Margaret's death with basically the civil wars between her sons and Malcolm's previous sons, at this point, when Turgot writes, Donald and Duncan, so the brother of Malcolm and his eldest son, have both been defeated. However, the dust has only just settled, and Duncan has a son. I think he's only a child at this point, but that doesn't mean he's not a threat. So it follows that Margaret's children would want to really hype up their maternal heritage because their paternal heritage isn't as useful for taking and keeping the crown of Scotland. Like, so what is if Malcolm was your dad? He was related to them too. Like, you're not special. Saying that, oh, well, we're related to this amazing woman called Margaret, they are outflanking the kind of Malcolm's other descendants. And then the other reason that Edith Matilda would have commissioned this biography is because her husband, Henry I of England, has a very vested interest in augmenting the descent via Margaret, because Margaret is descended or related to Edward the Confessor. And I think this is something that Margaret understood about amping up this kind of like old Anglo-Saxon heritage, because she did give her children all old English names. So Henry's marriage to Edith Matilda would unite the claims of the pre-Norman House of Wessex with the new Norman dynasty. He's kind of absorbing their line. And the historian Stephen Boardman says that Edith Matilda's commissioning of the Vita gifted her husband the legacy of the Saxon monarchy. So all of this came from the fact that they needed to unite these two dynasties and also just amp up Margaret kind of time and time again. And then Margaret is, after she dies, she's buried at Dunfermline, which then becomes kind of a royal mausoleum. So Malcolm III had been buried in, I think, Tynemouth Priory, which was closer to where he had died. But one of his sons has him reburied at Dunfermline. Edgar, Alexander, and David, they're all buried at Dunfermline. Between 1093 and 1420, 19 monarchs or their kind of close royal family members are buried at Dunfermline, which becomes kind of the central focus of devotions at that site. Miracles are said to have been performed there. But none of the miracles, they're mainly healing miracles, which is kind of, the popular ones at this point. And my favorite ones are where she yells at people.
Like the ghost of St. Margaret?
Yeah, so there's at one point a woman turns up and she's like, will you heal me? And she sleeps there, and Margaret appears during the night and says, and this was recorded and written down by the monks at Dunfermline, wake up, wretched woman. Wake up, thoughtless woman, for through me the heavenly mercy has deigned to hear you favourably. Can you imagine if you were just like, oh, please heal me. Oh, I love you, Margaret. And she appears and calls you a wretched woman. I would not tell the monks in order for it to be written down. I would be telling nobody. I would be taking that to my grave.
No, exactly. If you were like, please, I want to get a good mark on this paper, St. Margaret, please help me. And she's like, listen up, fuckwad.
Yeah. Well, there's another one which kind of, she doesn't appear as a ghost for the exciting bit. There's one where basically some guy's in love with one of his servants, but his dad is like, you can't be in a relationship with her. But then the dad dies and the guy gets into a relationship with his servant. And then the dad's ghost appears and like punches the servant. And then the servant then comes to Dunfermline and is asked to be healed. So Margaret isn't the one doing the punching, but the way it's written, they are seemingly connected. So love that for her. And then one of the most famous miracles takes place in 1263. The King of Norway, Hakon IV, is trying to invade Scotland. And a knight who is, I think, unwell, he sleeps at Dunfermline, like on the way to the battle. And Margaret appears to him and she's with like other men, and they're all kind of, ghostly apparitions. And the knight is like, who are these people? And she's like, I'm Margaret, blah, blah, blah. And these people, this is my husband and some of her sons. And Margaret kind of promises that they will defeat the King of Norway and his forces. And neither Malcolm nor any of the sons say anything. It's just Margaret who speaks, and she declares that Scotland is her kingdom. She says, accepted from God and entrusted to me and my heirs forever. Malcolm is literally just some guy in this. Like, he's there. He's around, but that's about it. And then there is one miracle that took place before Margaret died. And I don't want to be a hater, though I'm great at it. but do not get your hopes up, okay?
Okay.
So Turgo sets the scene by saying, oh, miracles are fine, but they aren't as important as like good works and virtue, which is probably true. I believe that he believes that. But I think he's also trying to manage expectations, because the miracle that he relates is that Margaret asks for a book to be brought to her, a gospel book that she especially favours. And the messenger drops the book in a river on the way, doesn't realise until he gets to Margaret and is like, oh, I dropped that book. And they go and get it, and they're like, well, obviously it'll be ruined because it's in a river. And the book is not ruined. That's the miracle. It's not exactly water into wine, is it? It's kind of, yeah, I'm unimpressed with it. Turgo does say that, she prophesied her own death and that she foretold certain future events on her deathbed. She may have foretold her death, but she really pushed her body to the brink with kind of her ascetic practices. Like, it wasn't a surprise that she was dying. She hadn't been able to ride.
Was she doing like too much fasting and like stuff like that?
Yeah, big on like the abstinence fasting. She used to go and pray in a cave, which was like really cold. It's obviously going to be cold. It's a cave in Scotland. Don't worship in a cave in Scotland. Okay, you will probably catch a death of cold.
And she's probably wearing like a hair shirt at the time and stuff.
Yeah, I'm not sure if she really went in for that kind of like the real brutal stuff, but she didn't like look after herself. And it was because, she was obviously very, very devoted.
I'm just going to say also, well, and she also had 8 children. So I feel like having 8 children now versus like then, just in terms of medical care, like her body would be affected by all that. And then if you're also not caring for that body that has given birth to 8 children in like medieval Scotland. Yeah.
She has 8 children over 14 years, which is not very long. And we only ever hear about the 8 children that she has, and they all pretty much survived to adulthood. She may well have been pregnant at other times, but either couldn't carry it to term or that the child died when it was very, very young. So she had 8 children as a minimum kind of thing. And then there is a bit when she's on her deathbed, she's kind of, it might be slightly before she dies, but basically Turgo says that Margaret told him that if her sons do ever become kings, Turgo is allowed to tell them what to do and to kind of admonish them or argue with them if necessary. Now, bearing in mind, Turgo is writing this in the early 1100s after Margaret's sons have, like, Edgar is king at that point. It's very convenient that Turgo is basically saying, hey, Edgar, King of Scots, your mum told me that I can have a go at you if I want. Like, that's a little bit convenient to me. I'm not quite convinced. But after she's canonized in the 13th century.
And who decides that? Like, he wrote this thing being like, look at how she should be a saint. Like, who's the person who's like checks off that box to be like, yeah, let's make her a saint?
So Turgo writes this vita of her, and then it has survived in kind of various like manuscript compilations. And there's a couple of these compilations that are very much, there's one called like the Dunfermline compilation. And it's basically like a little pack, like, here, Mr. Pope, this is why we want her to be canonized. Thank you. Because by the time she is canonized in the 13th century, the papacy has taken on, like, we're the only ones who are allowed to do this. But then the miracles, so the one of her yelling at people and appearing as a ghost, they are put together kind of in, I think it's mainly in the 12th century. And that is written by the monks at Dunfermline, who are like preserving her shrine. So it's kind of all these little things that are then put together to be like, please canonize her now. Appreciate that. And for like the rest of the medieval period, she remains a dynastic saint. So she is considered the foundress of the Scottish royal line, arguably more than Malcolm was. Like,
it's just like he's just Ken. Like, it's a real he's just Ken vibe. Yeah.
100%. And like, I think they probably got along well, and they certainly had a very productive relationship, both in terms of actual children, but also like what they did and the impacts they made eventually on Scotland. But yeah, he's meant to be a very good warrior and he's meant to be very noble and all that stuff. But he's, I, the stuff that you can say about Malcolm, I think you could say about any other king. Margaret is a little bit more unique. And the way she is interpreted by the subsequent generations is, there's a huge emphasis on her relationship to Edward the Confessor, because when England and Scotland are beefing, as we are still wont to do, it kind of benefited the Scots to point out that, oh, well, if you're descended from these like illustrious pre-Norman kings, well, guess what? So are we. And our dynastic go-between, she's a saint. Like, none of your monarchs are saints. Like, Edward the Confessor was canonized, but I don't think any of the others were. I'll have to look into that. I love learning about this kind of stuff. But the way you see Margaret's emphasis to Edward the Confessor, because in depictions of Margaret, she is often shown with the coat of arms of Edward the Confessor, which is like a blue background, and then it has like a yellow or a gold cross, and then 4 little birds in kind of each quadrant of the cross. These arms were like assigned to Edward the Confessor after the point, because heraldic symbols didn't exist when he was alive. But they then get to be like, oh, well, this is Edward the Confessor's. And you see it on Margaret's, like, most of the depictions. There's some depictions of her, and like her dress has the shield with the little birds on. So it's always Edward the Confessor is kind of like the key here. And in 1250 she's canonized, and her remains, which are at Dunfermline, they are moved to a more important spot at Dunfermline. And the King of Scotland at that point, Alexander III, and his queen, who is a Margaret of England, they are at this ceremony, and they're children at this point. But I get the sense that the reason Margaret, this little Queen Margaret of England, was included is because it's like, hey, maybe you should do like this woman did and be really pious and have loads of children. And then at the kind of moving forward in time, at the turn of the 14th century, Margaret finds an incredible champion in Robert the Bruce, who is obsessed with her. So at the Battle of Bannockburn, he has, I think, some of her relics brought out. He patronizes the abbey at Dunfermline. He's buried at Dunfermline, as are most of, like, a huge amount of his family and his friends. And she has become like a national figure at this point. So when Edward I of England kind of all but conquers Scotland, he chooses to hear the submission of various clergymen in that chapel dedicated to St Margaret in Edinburgh Castle. And at one point, when he's kind of overwintering in Scotland, he makes Dunfermline Abbey his like military base. So he clearly knows how important she is, and that she is a key symbol that he can then kind of co-opt and use. And you also get in this period her national significance emphasized by a guy called Walter Bower. He was a monk, and he wrote a chronicle called the Scotic Chronicon. And he's basically taking a load of pre-existing work by this guy called John of Fordun, and he adds to it. And all of the bits about Margaret, he adds like himself. And he gives a description of the ceremony in 1250 that moved Margaret's remains. And he says that when they were moving her like coffin towards the high altar, that when they tried to move the coffin past where her husband, Malcolm III, was buried, she wouldn't move. Like the people carrying her couldn't carry her any further. And so to Bower, he's like, this meant that Margaret refused to be moved to like a more illustrious place unless her husband was also moved there too, which is what happens. His remains are moved too. And I find this interesting because it kind of contradicts Turgot's version of events. And I think Bower neutralizes Margaret's independence in this kind of situation. Like at one point, he says that Margaret and her husband were equal in works of charity, both outstanding in the pursuit of holiness, which is definitely not Turgot's perspective. And I think it's because Turgot and Bower, they're at cross purposes. Turgot kind of needs Margaret to be bolder and a little more pious so that she can successfully evangelize to her husband, whereas Bower just needs like a saintly foundress with national significance. You know, I don't think their goals were the same, and that's why we get this discordance. And Margaret kind of remains popular. Her cult doesn't ever really drop out until the Reformation. But the kind of later Stuart monarchs are not as focused on her as like her immediate descendants, and then like Robert the Bruce. So after the year 1420, none of the Stuart royals are buried at Dunfermline. One of the interesting elements of her cult in this period is the use of her shirt as a relic.
Her shirt.
Yes. So there are several instances we hear when a Queen Consort of Scotland has her shirt on hand during childbirth. So Mary of Guelders did, Margaret Tudor did, possibly Elizabeth de Burgh, who was Robert the Bruce's, I think, his second wife. So they had it to like help them through childbirth. And so sometimes you'll see her, like we were saying earlier, she is the patron saint of Scotland. Sometimes people will say that she is also like the patron saint for childbirth. I don't think she is. So obviously she's had all these kids, but we never see her, whether it's Turgot or later, we never see her as being especially regarded for kind of her, for childbirth and the labour of giving birth. It's just about her like raising and nurturing the children as she raised and nurtured Scotland, I guess. And so my view is that the use of this relic is another dynastic expression. It's not about a queen. It's not about a woman giving birth. It's about a queen providing an heir for the royal dynasty, because the shirt doesn't seem to be used on every queen that we know of, and it doesn't seem to have been used in every instance of childbirth. So I think Margaret Tudor only uses it once, and like Joan Beaufort, who was James I's queen, had like 1 million children, and I don't think we ever hear of it being used with her. So I think it's more about like ushering in the next monarch. And she has another relic, which was her head, just her whole head. And Mary Queen of Scots had that with her.
Mary Queen of Scots had the head?
Yeah. So I think it was when she gave birth. And yeah, so she had the head. And then when the Reformation happened, the Reformation happened before she gave birth. So I'd have to check that. But Mary Queen of Scots definitely had her head. And it was hidden then, I guess, until after her deposition. It was hidden from like the reformist iconoclasts, and then it got smuggled to the continent and ended up in France, and they were like, oh, it's safe. And then the French Revolution happened. So it was like, oh no. And I don't think we know where it is now. And the shrine, her grave at Dunfermline, is now empty. Her remains were probably smuggled out for the Reformation, and they're probably in Spain. Spain took like a whole bunch of relics to kind of save them from the Reformation. And a load of them are in Madrid in the Escorial Palace. But because there's so many there, I don't think it's like, nobody has done like an audit. There has not been a stock take done fully. So she might be there, she might not. There is a piece of her shoulder bone, which is in Dunfermline, but it's not at the Abbey, which is now, the Abbey's kind of defunct, but it's still a parish church. Her shoulder bone is at a newer Catholic church in the town, and they bring it out for a parade every year. So that's really nice for her. And like, she would be scarier as a ghost now because she has no shoulder bone and no head. So if she had appeared to me like fully with her head, I wouldn't be as scared. But I think if she appeared to me, which would you be more scared of?
I would be most scared if she appeared to me and she was just a shoulder bone, just a ghost of a shoulder bone.
Oh my goodness.
Somehow yelling at me. Yeah.
I'm hoping at some point to be in Edinburgh when they do the parade. I think they do it in summer. So maybe I'll go and ask. Because obviously the Scotland's now Presbyterian, so they don't have any relics and things. So I might go and hang out with the Catholic Church and be like, which would scare you more?
Yeah.
If it was just a shoulder bone, I'll do like a little vox pop thing and survey everybody. But some of the other things we have of hers, in the 19th century, the Bodleian Library at Oxford acquired a gospel book. And I think they thought originally that it was from the 14th century, but then it turned out it was from the 11th century. And it had an inscription that the book was once owned by a king and queen. And the inscription mentioned the thing about the river miracle, and the pages themselves were consistent with if they'd had a slight amount of water damage. So like, this is it. This is her gospel book. So we found it. So that's nice. And then the other kind of parts of her legacy that I think most Scottish people would have some familiarity with is there is a bridge called the Queensferry Bridge, and it refers to the Queensferry crossing across the Forth that she set up. She was like, when pilgrims want to go from like the south bank of the Forth to St Andrews, which is like across the river and all the way up, we should set up like a free ferry for them to go and do that. And so Queen's Ferry, she is the queen for which it is named. And then another Mary Queen of Scots associated thing. So obviously there's Dunfermline Abbey, which is related to her, but Holyrood Abbey probably exists and Holyrood House because of her. So she was said to have brought to Scotland a piece of the true cross or Holy Rood, which, you know, is obviously a bit of the crucifix upon which Jesus allegedly met his end. I say allegedly because if you gathered together all of the fragments of the true cross that were meant to be hanging about Christendom, you would have enough materials for a 2-bed log cabin. Like, there was a lot of it. There was a lot of it about. But she apparently had one. And we're not 100% sure where it might have come from. So it might have come from England or it might have come from Eastern Europe, but she brings it with her. And then after her death, and when her youngest son, David, is king, he founds an abbey, which is kind of just north of Arthur's Seat at what is now the westernmost end of the Royal Mile. This abbey is dedicated to this piece of the Holy Rood. So that's where we get Holyrood from. And the abbey is in ruins now, but it was very important. So James II and his Queen Mary of Guelders were buried there. Margaret Tudor was married there. And also, I think after the Reformation, like, you know, everything kind of became defunct with it. But the abbey was briefly reconsecrated as a Catholic place of worship by the brother of Charles II, James. He was Duke of York at the time, and he basically was like the king's lieutenant in Scotland for a bit, and he was Catholic, so he had it reconsecrated as a Catholic place of worship. But then obviously that didn't last. And then obviously Holyrood House, the pleasure palace, in contrast to Edinburgh Castle, which of course hosted, among other things, a murder of which Mary, Queen of Scots, was witness. So it's funny to think, even though St Margaret, you know, had nothing to do with it, it does all get traced back to her. And then, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there is the chapel. This was probably built under David and is in Edinburgh Castle, dedicated to St Margaret. It is beautiful. I highly recommend anybody, like, do not skip it if you're going to the castle. It's very small, it's very peaceful. And it has a set of like stained glass windows from the 20th century, which shows various figures from Scottish history. And you will love this. Okay, the best bit about the chapel, it is looked after today by the St Margaret's Chapel Guild, and they put flowers in like every week. And I think in 1993, they like commissioned a new altar cloth to commemorate kind of the millennium of her death. But if you want to be a part of the guild, you have to have as your first or middle name Margaret.
Oh,
I know you can have institutional membership if your organization has been named for a Margaret. Like, it doesn't have to be that Margaret.
Margaret's only. Okay.
Yeah, I know. And when this is just, it's so adorable. When I wrote my term paper on her, I emailed the Chapel Guild and was like, because they have like a little booklet leaflet that you can buy in the chapel. And I was like, would you be able to send me one? And when the woman replied to me, in like her email signature, had her first name and then in brackets, middle Margaret, and then her surname. Like, is that not just the cutest thing? She was so nice as well. She came and posted me that she was very interested in what I was writing about. But like, it's so random.
No, but just like, first of all, I'm just like, I love this. I love this like league of Margarets who are just like doing this. But also I'm just like, but my name's not Margaret. I'm like, can I change my name to Margaret? Like, I'm desperate to join now.
I think if you said I've changed my name to Margaret because I want to join, I think they'd be like, yes, you can come in. And it still is quite a popular name in Scotland. Like, if this was in England, I think you would eventually run out of Margarets. But in Scotland, they're like, no, we will keep the tradition going. And yeah, I highly recommend like going into the chapel. The, the castle generally is kind of hit and miss in terms of access. I got my wheelchair stuck in a rockery outside the chapel when I was there, and I just kind of had to wait for my mum to come and get me, and as tourists walked past, which also was quite funny to me. But Scotland does not have the monopoly on Margaret. So we talked about earlier about the fact that she was born in Hungary. When I went to visit her now empty tomb at Dunfermline, there were some flowers and ribbons that had been left there by a group of Hungarian tourists. Like they were like, oh, one of us kind of thing, which I thought was very cool. But Margaret of Wessex, obviously that was her OG family, still very much looms large. So, as I said, I live in the southwest of England. And after I'd written my first paper on her, my mum told me, she was like, oh, in Salisbury Cathedral, there is a chapel dedicated to her. And I was like, no, there isn't. Like, it will be Margaret of Antioch, who, no shade to Margaret of Antioch, it's not her fault. But when people say like, oh, you study St. Margaret, the one with the dragon, and I'm like, no, the one whose book fell in a river. So not to be a hater to Margaret of Antioch, it's not her fault, but at the same time, I remain salty about it. But my mother was right, and there is a chapel dedicated to St. Margaret of Scotland in the south transept of Salisbury Cathedral. It has occupied my every waking moment, finding out how, when, or why this altar is there. It could have been put in as early as 1407. But it definitely was there before 1445. There is a text that is like guiding somebody around all of like, oh, when you go to Salisbury Cathedral, these are the chapels you need to look at. And it mentions her. So we know it was there then. In 1407, a bishop called Richard Mitford was buried in her chapel. So it could have been that like the chapel was put together for that burial, or that it already existed. And then Mitford was like, oh, please bury me there. But like, why is she there? Because all of the other chapels in the cathedral are dedicated to like the bigger saints. So she's next to St. Lawrence, and I think the Archangel Michael, I think. And then it's like John the Baptist. It's kind of like your standard big Christian saints.
like John the Baptist. Yeah. So like
yeah.
The kind of the main ones. And she's like, hey, I'm here too.
I think the only explanation, even though it's quite circumstantial, but the current best explanation is that she was considered like still to be part of kind of the West Country and Wessex. And then allegedly Bishop Richard Mitford was apparently a fan of Edward the Confessor. So it might be that he was like, either bury me there where her altar already exists, her chapel, or let's put this chapel together and then bury me there when I die. And every time I've been to the cathedral since finding this out, I'm just like scouring the place to try and find something, like looking for Edward the Confessor's coat of arms, or is there anything that suggests why she would be here? And there's also in Gloucester, which is also part of the West Country, there is a church, a small like village church dedicated to her. And this one is more confusing, because originally the church was dedicated to a different saint, but they're not sure which. And then it was rededicated in I think it was 1315, it was rededicated to Margaret of Scotland. And this was during the wars of Scottish independence. So I'm like, why did they change the patron saint of this church from whoever it was to like the key propaganda vehicle of the country with which we are currently at war? Like, was it trying to kind of reclaim her from the Scots and being like, no, she's actually one of us? Was it that maybe the people in that parish were like, thought that the Scots had a point and were like, we're going to do it to show solidarity? I have no idea. But both of those things, there was in the descriptions of her miracles, there is a couple of people who have come from England. So there were probably English people who were like fans of her, but it's just like, why was these dedications happening like quite a long time after her death and even after her canonization?
I have a theory. My theory is that her ghost came and yelled at somebody until they did it.
I mean, if you were being haunted by a ghost and all it wanted you to do was to, like, can you dedicate a chapel to me? It's a small price to pay.
To like get the ghost the ghost of the shoulder bone, or person without shoulder bone, or with or without head.
Exactly.
You're just like, I will do that if you will stop haunting and yelling at me. Yeah.
So she did have like fans in England, and I know I mentioned Durham earlier, and there was an instance in the 14th century of allegedly Durham stole some relics of her from Scotland and like smuggled them back. And the St. George's Church in Windsor Castle apparently has a relic of hers too. It might be, I'm not 100% sure, it might be the Holy Rood thing, because I think Edward I took that when he first like kind of conquered Scotland, and then there was like debate over whether he was going to give it back, but I don't think it ever was given back. So it might have also been lost in the Reformation, or it might be at St. George's in Windsor. But I think it's very the way her relics have kind of been scattered or not, or possibly come back, I think is exemplifies her legacy, which I feel like it's not like sad, but I think she's never been allowed to live her life for herself. It's always about her as a dynastic intermediary. Her holiness is useful and her legacy is valuable for what it can do for her subsequent generations. Like, you get the sense that she's not really in charge of her destiny. But I do think that given the depth of her religious devotion, I don't know if she'd be that bothered about it. Like, she might see her role as a saint to, reveal God's grace. And then her role as a queen is to kind of preserve and protect the kingdom with which she was charged by God. So even though sometimes I'm like, oh, it's kind of a lack of autonomy, she might have seen it as like, no, it's my purpose that I have been assigned. But she definitely is not in control of everything that happened after she died. I don't think she'd be mad about how it all went down, but it's stuff that has, like, people and monarchs and whoever has assigned this stuff to her.
What I find interesting, well, everything, obviously, that's why you're on the podcast telling the story. But so, in terms of Scottish women moving to Scotland and marrying kings, this is the best version of that I've ever heard. Like, Marie of Guise had a really rough time. Margaret Tudor had a really rough time. Like, even Mary Queen of Scots, who didn't marry into it, but she was an outsider. But Margaret of Scotland came there, and it seems like everyone's like, cool, you're an outsider and you're marrying our king. We don't mind. Like,
Yeah.
I just find it's such an interesting contrast to what I'm used to hearing about people named Margaret coming to Scotland. Historically, to me, doesn't do well.
Yeah, she, at least the version that we have of her from Targo, she seems to have been quite happy. I think she was very invested in piety, obviously, and in the church. And she did kind of all the normal things that pious women are meant to do. She fed orphans and all that kind of thing and washed people's feet. And I think she ended up becoming an exemplar for later queens in the same position. So obviously, we said about the young Margaret of England going to see her relics being moved. And then obviously Margaret Tudor having her shirt and stuff. So I imagine that if I was a little English princess going up to, okay, you're marrying the King of Scots, I would look at St. Margaret's story and be like, oh, well, I hope it's like this.
Mm-hmm.
This, I could cope with this. This doesn't seem too bad. My dream museum exhibit, if someone said, right, here's a load of money and you're going to set up an exhibit for a museum, would be Princesses of England, Queens of Scots. And it would basically be talking about all the different English princesses that ended up being Queen of Scotland, because there were loads. Like, obviously, Margaret Tudor that we've talked about, and there was Joan, but there were two Joans. In the 15th century, you had Margaret of Denmark and Mary of Guelders, so you had some European ones. But because of the way England and Scotland, like the relations and the conflicts that have happened, it was very often like, oh, well, we've had a war, and now to seal the peace, here's a daughter, have at it, kind of thing. But it's also, in a lot of the later examples, there was always like a dynastic element, like especially with Margaret Tudor, because obviously her children represented the potential heirs to England. Whereas with Margaret and her family, they were in kind of direct opposition to the King of England as kind of William the Conqueror. But yeah, I think like she did okay, and she's had such a huge impact. I think I made a reel. It was a while ago now, and it was talking about how Edgar, like poor Edgar, her brother, like he gets carted off to England as really young. His dad dies, and then he spends like the rest of his life kind of beefing with the King of England because he's a potential claimant, blah, blah, blah. And then Margaret, like she has those bad things happen. And then she moves to Scotland and is Scotland's only canonized royal saint and one of the most famous, like in terms, maybe not in outside of Scotland, obviously Mary, Queen of Scots is more famous, but in Scotland, she's probably second fiddle to Mary, Queen of Scots in terms of the most famous and certainly the most influential Queens of Scots. So yeah, sorry, Edgar, you didn't really have a nice time of it necessarily, but Margaret certainly did. And then her daughter obviously married Henry I of England, who then they obviously had their daughter Empress Matilda, and because of Edith Matilda, every monarch of England and then Scotland, etc., all the way from then is descended from St. Margaret. So yes, it wasn't just about her power. It was so much of it was dependent on Edward the Confessor, but she was like the vehicle for that. And then Edith Matilda was as well. And yeah, Edith Matilda was meant to be quite a popular queen. She was raised at Romsey Abbey, which has the Saint of Romsey Abbey. I don't think it's an Ethelfled. It's one of those names. But yeah, so she lived there for a bit, and then there was drama over whether or not she had taken vows to become a nun, because then Henry I of England wanted to marry her, and it was like debate over whether she was allowed. And then it was decided that she wasn't, so she married him. And she was good friends with a guy called William of Malmesbury, who was a chronicler and quite a prolific historian, and she patronized some of his stuff. She had another vita commissioned as well for an Irish saint, I think, called Brendan. So she was interested in kind of literature and commissioning these texts. So yeah, she died relatively young. She only died in 1118, and then Henry I remarried, but then didn't have any children. And obviously, Empress Matilda's brother had died in 1120, I think, in the White Ship disaster. And so that all obviously set off the anarchy and everything. But Edith Matilda had passed away long before any of that. So even though, and I think this is why it resonates, I think, especially like when I first started my master's, like it was during COVID. And so, weren't seeing everybody who I wanted to be. And so having Empress Matilda, Edith Matilda, and Margaret as these three women that do resemble each other in a lot of ways, who barely knew each other. Like Edith Matilda was sent off when she was a child. Empress Matilda was sent off to go and get married on the continent. So from the way their lives played out, you would have assumed like, oh, well, they knew each other really well. Of course, they related. They barely knew each other, except obviously through writing and stuff. So I think Margaret would be proud that even without like physical contact with her like descendants, that her legacy was protected and furthered. And like in Scotland, understandably, there is a lot of emphasis on what she did in Scotland. So Dunfermline it was just made a city to commemorate maybe the Platinum Jubilee. I can't remember, something like that. So it's going to become a city, and it's a very, very small place. It has a palace as well, the ruins of a palace where various monarchs, I think Charles I was born there. I can't remember. But yeah, the things she did in Scotland and her legacy in Scotland is very interesting. But I find it's like Edith Matilda was it. if Edith Matilda hadn't made the decisions that she made, we wouldn't be talking about her. Like, she put together, she organized, Edith Matilda would use Pinterest, and she would have been like, this is how I'm going to get my mum canonized. And like, not only did she eventually get her mum canonized, I think what she was doing in that moment of, I'm going to have this vita written about her, was, I'm going to back up what my brothers are struggling with in Scotland. So David, who was obviously one of the youngest, I think he was the youngest child, lived in England with Edith Matilda when she was queen, like at her royal court for a bit. And that's another thing I forgot to say about this. When the anarchy happened with Empress Matilda, her uncle David fought on her behalf and was kind of involved.
And that's David. That's David.
Yeah. So Margaret's youngest son, David, who is sometimes referred to as like Saint David. Like there's like a park that's called like Royal Saint David, but he was never actually canonized. Sorry, only Margaret was. So sucks to be you guys, I guess. Like Robert the Bruce was another one that there were, understandably, people wanted him canonized, and I don't know, I'm just like, well, you can't. Sorry, it's only for Margaret.
She's the only one.
Yeah. So I love that for her. But yeah, the impact that she had, I think, is short term and long term. And I don't know if she would ever have been like, I'm going to have that long term. I think if somebody said to her, like on her deathbed, you're going to get canonized, she'd be like, yeah, I know. Like, I think she backed herself, but the way everything would play out, she also would have been like, what do you mean this happened in 100 years? That's really distant from me now. I don't like, she wouldn't be able to understand what we're doing now.
Yeah.
Obviously. But in terms of, I think she would know that she would make waves.
I love that she is so remembered in all these ways still. I love that it's like largely because her daughter commissioned this work, but also just so often women who are like this, queens, I guess, who get married and do a good job and have a bunch of children and then die. Like, how many queens did that? Lots. But we don't know about them, but her we do. So I appreciate that. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the Roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back.
Exactly. Like, it's very much almost kind of a chance of fate that we do have so much about her now. And I do think, because we've got the ratings. I have written down what I think her ratings will be.
Oh, we're going to get to the ratings for sure. Yeah. And this will be interesting. And I do want to say, I don't know, it's interesting. Like, I do the ratings just to compare everyone who I talk about on the podcast to each other in 4 random areas. It's very rare for anyone to score highly in all of them. Like, I feel like she
don't get excited. It's like that miracle with the book. It's nothing to write home about.
Exactly. I mean, I will say that the lowest score anyone has ever gotten was 1. Queen Charlotte.
Who was that?
Queen Charlotte got 1.
Oh, bless her.
She was just a really boring person.
I think with a lot of the women that you talk about, I think some of them they would want a lower score.
Yes, exactly. And I think Queen Charlotte would be mad we even gave her 1, probably.
Like, maybe in some ways they would be like, oh no, I understand, I get that. But I think it's like the opposite of what, but then that's the thing about history, isn't it? We're seeing it through unapologetically sometimes through our eyes, and they would be horrified and mortified that we have bigged up these things that maybe they would not have wanted emphasis brought upon.
Well, that's exactly, like, I think Margaret is, like, again, like, the sort of people who we don't hear about a lot are people who are just, like, married successfully and had children and didn't do anything scandalous. I think they'd be like, good. I forget where I read this, but someone said at some point in history, like, a woman's name should only be written down, like, when she's born, when she's married, and when she dies. Like, that means that she lived properly. Like,
yeah,
because she got married, she had children, and then she died. It's like,
well, that's the thing, because Margaret it was so important suddenly to have her have this huge, like, publicity, because when you look at it compared to, like, the Malcolm side who were like, oh no, we're going to be king instead, you couldn't say, like, Margaret's sons couldn't say, what was the point in them bigging up their relationship to Malcolm? Like, you ain't special. Those guys are related to Malcolm too. Margaret was the secret weapon. She was the nuclear bomb of the 1090s, where it's like, no, we have something that you don't have. Like, sorry, Ingeborg, who obviously we don't know if she had died before Malcolm married Margaret, but I don't think we even know, like, when that might have happened. Most of the time she's not mentioned in discussions of Margaret.
mm-hmm.
It's only the stuff where it's, like, specifically a biography of her that we get Ingeborg mentioned. There's a lot of reverence dedicated to her by Scottish historians, like, throughout the centuries. There's one, I'm looking at him right now, Michael Lynch, and he's a very, very good historian. But he basically kind of doesn't buy that she was as involved in, like, the reform of the church. Well, what does Hepburn think about it?
She's got some real thoughts here. What do you think about her involvement in the reform of the church, Hepburn? Yeah, she's got
That's
lots to say.
I thought she was going to say.
Yeah.
You're so right, Hepburn.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
I mean, case closed.
Exactly. But yeah, so there's kind of, you get some people kind of being like, oh, she just rode roughshod over everyone, like, it was so unfair, and she just kind of, like, was tyrannical. And then you've got some people being like, she probably didn't do anything. It's like she kind of can't win in that respect.
So yeah, I mean, we'll get to the scoring, and I mean, again, it's rare for anyone to score highly in all of the categories, and that's why there are 4 different categories, so that everyone has a chance to score highly in at least one. And so the first category is scandaliciousness. How scandalous was she in her time? I mean, You have your thoughts you've written down. I'll just say, based on everything that you shared with us, like, I don't think at all, except for her involvement in who's going to be king of England and who is she backing, and just her, not her doing anything, but just like her existence was maybe,
She could have been a problem,
yeah.
I think, from the Normans' perspective. It's like, we need to, like, Edgar was definitely, Edgar did get involved back and forth with different rebellions, and they never came to anything. But yeah, the family, they had a claim. Whether or not they were ever going to be able to make good on it, they're always kind of there in the background. I have given her a 1 in terms of scandalicity. So I think there's the point of, can we take the reading of like her biography at face value? But I think either way, she was very in keeping with how royal piety should look. And even though Turgot did kind of struggle at times to push her into this kind of these models of sanctity, she was not doing anything that was like super outrageous. Like, when I was going through like her biography and stuff, sometimes it's like, wow, this woman did not know how to have fun. Like, she was a killjoy. She's always admonishing someone for something. There's at one point where she kind of delivers Malcolm a list of like things he's doing wrong as king. And one of them is like, you have to stop taking bribes. And it's like, let people enjoy things. She's just, if you said, right, you have to have a weekend away with either Saint Margaret or her eventual descendant, Margaret Tudor, I know who I would be picking.
I mean,
like, St. Margaret would be one of those people you go on holiday and she makes you go for like a run in the morning. Whereas like Margaret Tudor would be like, right, nobody is leaving their bed before 1 p.m. and then we go to brunch. Like, St. Margaret I don't think she was particularly entertaining.
No, she'd be like, we're going to go to this cave in Scotland. We're going to be underdressed and we're just going to fast.
Yeah. Oh God, just absolutely. It sounds absolutely insufferable at times, to be honest. But that's the cost of canonization, and it is a price I would never be willing to pay.
No, but if it's important to you, that's what you need to do. Scheminess. So this is like not. I mean, I think she'd be horrified that we would ever accuse her of scheminess, but just it's not. I don't think she did any literal schemes, but just sort of like coming up with plans, doing things, and she did do things like the abbeys and her involvement, whatever it was, with like Christianity developing.
I think she was very organized.
Mm-hmm, exactly, yeah.
But it was never in kind of like a subversive way. But I think you also said about like resilience under this. And I think if we're talking about how like resilient she is, that's like a high, I would say. Because like she's, randomly born in Hungary, ends up moving halfway across the continent. Her dad immediately dies. Her brother's potential claim to the throne is extinguished by an incredibly violent invasion. She ends up fleeing for her life and then somehow ends up becoming Scotland's only canonized royal. Like, she secured the bag.
Like, she did, like, not everybody in that life would have...
I wouldn't
thrive. No, exactly. Like, she had some sort of so in terms of scheminess, it's just like, this happens to me. Okay, let's do this. Like, let's flee to here. Let's agree to this marriage. Like, so it's she was making decisions. Yeah.
That's why I kind of think that she would have accepted that she had to marry. Like, I just think I think she was worldly isn't the right way. Like, she knew what life was about. She wasn't naive in any way. Like, even the way she is in her piety and stuff, she's like, this is what's going to happen and this is how, now go and do it. Like, she's very, because she does, like, it's Turgot being dramatic all the time as well, but he has her like basically reading the Riot Act to different clergy and like, this is how you're going to do it and this is why. And there's one bit, she's actually kind of shady. There's it's talking about the observance of Lent, and she says, you're not fasting for long enough. And they're like, no, we're fasting for this however many days. And she's like, wow, according to the book of blah, blah, blah. And she's like, and if you take 3 away from and carry the 1, yeah, exactly. That's what I thought. And they're like, oh, okay, sorry. So she knows what she's about. And I think it's not scheminess in a subversive way, but it's scheminess in a strategic way.
And I think that is kind of more what I'm thinking of for this category for her, but also like to go there in this very fractured, chaotic world and to be married to the King of Scotland and to be like, you know what I'm going to do? Like change how religion works. Like she could have been murdered. She could have been exiled, but she wasn't. So she must have made, we don't know this, but like clearly she would have made strategic alliances. Like she made sure that her husband supported her. So it's like behind the scenes. She did stuff. We just don't know what it was.
There's a couple of letters from her, and I can't remember if I think they're to her, but in response to letters from the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it's basically her setting up that monastery at Dunfermline. And it is implied by the letter that she has written and been like, can you send me some monks? And he's like, yeah, no, send them back when you're done. Have at it. So she has an independence from Malcolm in that respect. Like, you know, she was never like sidelining him at all, but I do not think she ever would have asked his permission to do these things. Or even if she did ask, the expectation, she was like, and you will say yes. So I would say like a 7.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, her biographer is being very careful to write her in this way, but between the lines and just things we know that she did, there was it reminds me of like those Frankish queens and stuff, like people where it's like you had to make the right alliances. Like like the fact that he was king and she was queen and she had all these children and nobody usurped him and nobody, you know, like that doesn't happen with no effort. Like you have to be like on your game.
It's that kind of key role of queens in the medieval period where it's like they were a partner, a junior partner. But I remember it was when that like audio on reels and whatever, where it was like, go ahead, light that candle or something. But it was basically like, go on, say something stupid and I will tell you you're wrong. And so I had it as people saying like, oh, but medieval queens had no power. And I was like, they were partners. They did not have the same power as their husband, but they had a power, and those who could be clever enough to use it to enormous benefit. And I think that's what she was doing. And like she allied with her husband. She I think Turgot does talk about like her welcoming foreign dignitaries, and apparently she was like, oh, let's make being royal nicer. Like it's kind of shit. Can we just like have a few more? Can we just do something about the decor, basically? And then she gives them a load of kids, and she enables Scotland to have dynastic security after the kind of hubbub after her immediate death, but eventually, and it stays in that dynasty for until now, really, I guess. You know how it works. Sort of the dynasties always, and then we've got like the spindle side and this, that, and the other. But yeah, she did that. She did that.
Yeah, she did the thing. Okay, significance. I mean,
I think this is a high one.
Yeah.
I've put a 9. I think, do you know what? I've put a 9 because a 10 seems like overdoing it, but I think she's a 10.
I think she's a 10. Like how much more significance could anyone have?
She is, apart from Margaret of Scots, I would say she's one of the most, like, she's had the most impact. And I think from the moment she married Malcolm, a series of events was set in motion that made her like the foundational matriarch for the Scottish royal dynasty. And like her image was a pivotal piece of Scottish propaganda. And like Robert the Bruce, who is, you know, Scotland's most famous king, was obsessed with her. So his body was buried at Dunfermline, even though his heart is at Melrose Abbey. Do you know what happened to Robert the Bruce's heart? It's quite a fun story.
No, please.
So when he died, he asked his bestie, I think it was, James Douglas of the Black Douglases, and was like, can you take my remains on crusade? And they were like, sure. And then the Holy Land was obviously quite far away, and there was crusading activities happening in Spain. So James was like, I think it was like, I'll just take the heart, like, which had been embalmed and stuff, and I'm going to take it on crusade in Spain. And apparently James Douglas, he had it like on a reliquary around the neck, and he yeeted it at the opposing army. And he was killed in this, but his body, I think, was recovered, and the heart was recovered, and is now at Melrose Abbey. I can't remember if Robert the Bruce wanted them to be separate, but I guarantee whoever is in charge of Melrose Abbey now is very glad that decision was made, because pilgrims mean prizes, and it's an excuse. If you've got something to do with Robert the Bruce, tourists come. So I think they're probably quite glad that they've got the bit of his heart. And then, his body was in Dunfermline along with both his wives, I think. And then there's a list of like all the people who were buried there, and it was like some of his sisters were, and like I think possibly some in-laws as well, and like some, like his son-in-law is also buried there. So he was clearly like, everybody, let's meet at Dunfermline. Hopefully we can appear to some pilgrims and scare them.
Like in a big group of ghosts, and Margaret can be your spokesperson, and just everyone hangs out.
There's also, when I was doing one of my essays on this, I was trying to look something up to do with Malcolm, like who's related to so-and-so, whatever. And it said it had like a family tree of his, and one of the people in the family tree was somebody called Princess Catherine or Katerina. And I was like, oh, I didn't know there was, like, that's not a common name in that period. So I looked into it, and I had accidentally found the fandom Wikipedia page for a cartoon called Gargoyles, which has a character based on Malcolm the Third. It was a very strange thing to stumble upon. So maybe he would have a significance in that. I think he should get some points on the significance for being famous enough. He's in Macbeth, and he's in the children's TV show Gargoyles. What more do you want?
Exactly. Well, I mean, so many people are not remembered, and those are two pretty iconic ways to be remembered.
Yeah.
But 100%. I think the 10 for significance, like what you were saying about the like people from Hungary were revering her.
Yeah.
Like the fact that she's like in this church in Wessex, it's just like everywhere she ever, like the fact that there's a parade every year for her shoulder bone.
I know.
Like,
and they changed. So she died in November, and I think it was the 18th of November, and they were like, that's her feast day. But then I think one of the kings changed it because they wanted it to be like in the summer or something. So the Catholic Church now is like, we do it at some point in June, which is very useful if you are a church in Scotland. I think more people are going to come to a parade in June than they would in November. But they like have it in a reliquary, and they take it on a little parade.
Well, now I'm picturing
so, that's nice for her.
Like, I like that. I love that actually for her. But also I'm like, now I'm picturing, there's this ceremonial, like people just yeet books into a river and then just like see which one is the most dry, and then you win a prize or something. I don't know.
That would be amazing. Or you could have, I don't know if you have in the, you're in Canada.
In Canada, yeah.
I don't know if you have like the hooker duck things at fairgrounds.
Oh yeah.
So you could have that, but it's like a little book, and you're fishing it out.
Yes.
Which I need to look this up, because when I was thinking about this yesterday, so the book would have been made of vellum or parchment, which is animal skin, and I was like, are they not slightly waterproof?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm not like, I'd have to double check. It might be that the way they're treated kind of removes any of that.
But I also feel like
property.
Like the book itself exists, and it's like, oh yeah, this looks a little water damaged. It's like, yeah, so maybe it wasn't at the bottom of the river. Oh,
this is like a coffee table. Imagine if it was the actual book and I just had it next to me.
Oh, you just have
time.
it. Cool, that's cool.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, like, so maybe he dropped it next to the river. Like, there's so many ways where this is potentially not miraculous. She's just, listeners, she's showing me a picture right now.
I'll send you the pictures and stuff. This is not from the gospel book, but this is do you see that's the coat of arms of Edward the Confessor? So it's got these little birds. And so there's a whole bunch of, I think they're called armorials or something. And most of the time when you are trying to find an image of a medieval Scottish queen, these like later medieval armorials had like the royal couples like drawn. So you get her with her little signature as it is. And like on the little booklet that they gave me.
Oh, the Margaret Society of Margarets. Yeah.
And then you can see it's got like that's the lion, which is one of the flags of Scotland, and then it's got the thing.
And you send me those pictures after, and then I can, listeners, there'll be a link in the show notes so you can see these all.
The chapel itself is absolutely beautiful. Highly recommend. And enjoy getting stuck in a rockery as I did. I was just like, Ma! And then some people, because I'm in my chat and people are like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, she's just coming. It's fine. This happens all the time.
The final category to score is the sexism bonus. And this is there for people who could have accomplished more were it not for sexism. I don't feel like that played a part in her story at all, unless.
Yeah, like the only place where I think it would come up, like arguably she's written in a way that is in keeping with ideals about gender. And so the whole virgin martyr paradigm and all that kind of thing. And obviously we don't know if that is an accurate reflection 100% of her. So you could argue that she is being kind of molded into the ideals of a patriarchal society. But where I would say she does face the sexism is with Walter Bauer, who he's whatever, but he kind of invents this idea that she wouldn't move without Malcolm being moved to. And I'm just like, why is that necessary? And when I was writing about it at uni, one of the historians was kind of talking about potentially like the ideals of what a queen should be had changed by the time it got to like Walter Bauer's era in the 1400s, I think. And so yeah, she gets demoted slightly. I think it's more to do with this cross purpose with Turgot, but it just feels like in all the other literature, Malcolm, he's just Ken, but he's fine with that. And then Walter Bauer is like, no, he wants his Mojo Dojo Casa House. And it's like, could you not have he was fine. He was perfectly happy. And then Walter Bauer was like, oh, poor Malcolm, like Margaret has to, submit to him slightly and she can't do anything without Malcolm. And it's like, really? Like he was just there. It was fine.
Is Walter Bauer the one who also said like, and maybe she wasn't involved in changing the religion?
Well, I don't know if he really talks about that, but the one who a lot of the historians who are skeptical about that are modern ones. So my man, Michael Lynch. Walter Bauer is 15th century. Mm-hmm. Yes. So he wrote this Scotichronicon, which is like, it's a very important book, etc., but it's basically a previous work by this guy, John of Fordun, and it's taken, and Walter Bauer just adds stuff to it. So he didn't do as much work as John of Fordun did. But but I just think we get such a view of Margaret as, it's never like she's rebelling. Well, actually, so she never rebels against her husband, except she does steal from him. There's like a bit where she keeps like stealing his money to go and give it to the poor, and Malcolm knows it's happening and like pretends like, oh, naughty Margaret, but actually is fine with it. Which is kind of a weird dynamic, but I guess it made sense then. And yeah, Walter Bauer, he's like the only one. You almost get the perspective that he thinks Malcolm would be upset about not getting like also credit for all of this. But Malcolm is a himbo. He is a good man. And I genuinely do not I genuinely think he'd be like, oh, good for her. He'd just be happy for her to do that. Like, he could have come to any of those miracle apparitions, but he only comes to one where it's the battle is being taken place. And he doesn't even speak. If he wanted to speak, he would have spoken. So I think Walter Bauer is assuming too much about Malcolm, unlike me, who is psychic and knows exactly what Malcolm would have wanted.
Exactly. Like, you get it. He didn't.
Exactly. So, and St. Margaret, I'm the one who's her now representation. Walter Bauer isn't.
No, exactly. Like, she helped you with that paper. You got the good mark.
Exactly.
Like, how many times have you visited her chapel? Like, you are here for her.
Actually, like I think I visited her chapel. I've been to Edinburgh Castle 3 times and visited it each time. And then the time that I got stuck in the rockery was we'd been in it, and then we went round again. And then just before we were about to leave, I was like, oh, I'm going to go see it again. And that's when I got stuck in a rockery.
That was her being like, too much. You can't visit me this much.
She's like, please get a life. Like, go. Little did she know I was going to come back to Salisbury Cathedral and make that. I have to know. Like, it is my Richard III, you know, the woman who was obsessed with finding Richard III's body, and then she found it. This is going to be mine. It's going to be the lowest stakes history mystery ever. But I have to, I've got timelines. I've got, like, it can't have been earlier than this. It must have been later than that. And she was clear, like, the chapel there, we have evidence of people giving their money to be like, can you say prayers to Margaret for me? And then there's a point, I think in like 1468, where there is a record from a bishop who visited to kind of do, like, check that everything was going okay. And he complained, he was like, oh, in whatever year, some money was given, £50 was given, which is obviously a huge amount of money then, to say prayers for this person at Margaret's chapel, but nobody's done it yet. So can you, like, get on with it? So we clearly know if somebody is leaving £50 for stuff to be said at her altar, like, she clearly was popular down there. So I'm like, what happened? Was it that she was really, really popular and then she's been forgotten? Or was it that she was briefly, this one guy was like, oh yeah, and then nothing really happened?
One guy really liked her, got the thing commissioned, like, paid the money, and it was just this one guy who was just really into it, and then he died and everyone's like, okay, moving on. Maybe it was that would be a great answer.
Because there's just all of the other chapels, it's very boring. Like, oh, I think Catherine of Alexandria is there and John the Baptist. There is Edmund of Abingdon, who is the only other, like, UK based Abingdons near Oxford, I think. So that's, like, the only other UK based saint there that you would consider, like, relative to Margaret, possibly. But yeah, and it's just like I have bought so many books of Salisbury Cathedral and none of them mention her.
Okay, so where do we land for this sexism?
I would say a 5, just because Walter Bauer yapping, and also I think because it's a case of, do we know 100% that the version we've got from Turgot and from other sources is not also filtered through sexism?
No, exactly. Yeah, I think just what she was like is now so divorced from what she actually was like, and it's so bound up in these ideas of, like, what a queen should be and what a woman should be. And
it's very interesting, like, her impact on queenship, specifically in Scotland. So obviously we talked about the shirt that she has that gets used as a relic, / her head. Typical Margaret of Scots, like, no, I don't just want her shirt, I want her disembodied, preserved head. So, she always got to do one better than everybody. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of assessment of whether or not other queens of Scotland kind of learned from her, or perhaps even if they didn't learn, they were clearly encouraged to be like, this is who you need to be.
Exactly. Like, look at her. She just had a bunch of babies and was really religious, and she didn't whatever. She didn't try to lead an army. She didn't try to start a revolution. And it's like, maybe she did. We don't know.
But then we then get that miracle of her in like that militarized setting where it's like this battle. And she basically, I don't think she has a sword, but I think the what's meant to be her husband and some of her sons, they're in coats of armor, I think. And then she's in like a white dress. But she's like, this was the Kingdom of Scotland was entrusted to me and my heirs. So she's not being militaristic. She's not being kind of militant, but she ends up getting used in a military capacity with the wars of independence and stuff, and ends up getting used for that purpose, even though she herself didn't really have anything to do with kind of any kind of conquest or anything like that.
She's just a multi-purpose icon.
She ends up becoming like all things to all people. Like she becomes very useful for different purposes. And I guess we are just another level of that. We are just a new iteration of what it is we think of her as.
Yeah, it's true. Just kind of you see in her what one wants to, like, there's just a lot of ways you can take it. I just want to let you know her final score then is a 23 out of 40, which is
that's not too bad.
No, that's actually quite good. And when I look at the scale, that's the same score as Boudica. So
love that. Redhead unite.
Exactly.
I think Margaret might have been a redhead as well. I'm sure there is a record we have from the 18th century of somebody who saw her head when it was in France. And I'm pretty sure they said she was ginger.
Yeah.
So
you know what?
Our impact.
That doesn't surprise me because there's a lot of badass ginger women.
Exactly.
Including.
I saw a thing that was like, I think it was a quote from Mark Twain about how redheads, instead of being descended from like primates or whatever, that redheads are descended from cats. I hope so.
I know, like I buy it. I like Hepburn and I, she was talking here earlier, like she and I converse constantly. Yeah.
I picked up Minnie and I was like, are we related?
God, I hope so. Yeah. Okay. So fabulous. I think a 23 is wonderful. I love that she's there with Boudica. They can hang out in ghost heaven together. So EK, tell everybody about all the places where they can follow all of your works online and what you're up to.
So I'm probably most often found on Instagram. I ran a little page called It's Like History, where the goal is to tell people about history in ways that are usually entertaining, but always informative, doing kind of little reels and what's the word? Like the lip syncing to different memes. Because I believe with all my heart that pop culture is an excellent way through which to learn about history, because history is just the pop culture of the past. So yeah, I'm on Instagram at It's Like History. And then I also have a Patreon that you can donate to, which is currently under Explain, which is EKSPLAINE. I've not yet transferred it over to the It's Like History. And I also have a YouTube channel where I do video essays, but not particularly frequently. But if you keep an eye on my Instagram, and then if I do post any new video essays, that is where they shall be found. So
I want to just mention that when I was doing my unending Mary Queen of Scots series, which involved episodes on Mary of Guise and Margaret Tudor, like I was scrolling through Instagram and just like every week I'm just like, what's the best reel that EK has done on exactly this topic? And people are like, I understand the references now.
There's Margaret Tudor especially is like, get like Paris Hilton. That's the vibe. Like it's so much about pop culture. That is how I approach how I study her, because that's all it is. Like pop culture is just people doing stuff today. So why would it not be people doing stuff then? And yeah, so she is just like a unending inspiration that I very often, I could fire off Margaret Tudor reels every other day. And I have to be like, no, you have to make something about somebody else. But because kind of I generally am found in kind of late medieval Western Europe, with a particular emphasis on Scotland. And yeah, Margaret Tudor is I would say she's one of the most entertaining. I don't know if you found this. She has sad parts to her story as well. But she's one of those people where you really understand the mistakes that she made. You can understand why and how she made those mistakes.
Was she, I'm just trying to, I remember there's so many iconic moments she's done, but wasn't she the one who like her dirtbag husband was like trying to come to Edinburgh and she just like pointed all the cannons at him and then he left?
So I think that was at Holyrood House. So she was there, and I think maybe Archibald Douglas, the sixth Earl of Angus, I think he was either coming from outside the city or he was coming from Edinburgh Castle, and she was like, put the cannons on him. I don't want to see him. And then I think one of the English ambassadors or some kind of diplomat is like, oh my God, what is she doing? And Margaret is like, basically, go away. Don't involve yourself in this. This has nothing to do with you. Leave, please. And she did. I don't think she did ever fire any of the cannons.
I don't think she did. I think just pointing them and aiming them, and him realizing that was enough to make him.
Oh no, yeah. She was very young when she became queen, and very young when she became widowed. And I think she made a lot of mistakes, and she was very proud. She was very willful. Like, I did find when I watched the Spanish Princess, and it was the version of her, I can't remember her name, but she's Lucy from the Chronicles of Narnia. I thought her portrayal was really, really good, where she's kind of a bit of a brat at times. She's not necessarily the smartest person in the room, but she is the most determined, that she really tried to make the best of a bad lot at times. And I think she's very unfairly maligned in kind of Scottish history, usually by men. She would, I can't remember what you rated her. She would, I think, get quite a high rating under sexism, especially.
Let me look. Yeah, and she's one. I was really happy that she was on The Spanish Princess, because like you've also been you've been watching The Tudors and stuff. But she is so often like, people are like, oh, what, Henry VIII sisters? I didn't know. It's like,
yeah,
they were so fascinating. Let me see. There's so many Margarets,
and obviously it's with Margaret Tudor, it's kind of similar to Margaret of Scotland in that they became this huge dynastic.
She like retroactively, she's so important. She got a 31.5, Margaret Tudor.
That's fair.
So almost
allow that.
10 more. Her daughter Margaret Douglas got a 28. I've really leaned into there's 6 people called Margarets. I'm just doing a search in my document.
They're everywhere. It's always her, and then Margaret of Antioch is the one that people are very often named after as well. Who, like, she was fine, I guess. Oh, I got eaten by a dragon, and then the dragon / demon / serpent spat me out. It's I get that that's more exciting than, I dropped a book
and it was miraculously dry. But you know what? Is it, back then books were so valuable to have a book.
Yeah. Exactly.
Her miracle counts too.
The person, like the courier who was bringing the book, must have just been like, oh my God, thank God. Like, never mind that being a like example of Margaret's holiness. I think potentially we should be looking at this courier, because he had some form of grace on his side.
You know what? We call it her miracle because she wanted to read the book, but like he's the one who is he praying to when he went back to get the book.
Exactly. Oh my goodness. If he appeared to you, headless or not, as a ghost, I don't know who I would find more intimidating.
I don't know.
This random courier.
The courier might be the one with the secret powers. I don't know. EK, thank you so much for joining me. This is a dream. I'm happy to have you back some other time, and I will scheme a way to make that happen. So
I will make a point of doing so. Thank you very much for having me. It's been absolutely lovely chatting to you on Instagram as well as now on here. It's always nice to kind of make connections and stuff over Instagram, just as once I'm sure Margaret would have wanted all of her daughters to do, etc. Oh, here we go.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Hepburn, for saying hello.
And thank you, Minnie, for being such a pleasant...
Yeah, she's probably gone downstairs by now, but yeah.
But she was very patient and much less noisy as my cat. So, The first reminder that I wanted to remind everybody about is that all this month, which is Women's History Month, we're doing a book club online about the book The Tower by Flora Carr, which is a historical fiction novel about Mary Queen of Scots during the time when she was in prison in Loch Leven, trapped in this tower with just Mary Seton was there. Young Willie is like one of her only allies, and how she managed her Ocean's 11 escape from there. It's a novel about that, one of the most exciting and happy ending-ist parts of the Mary Queen of Scots saga. So this book is available now. It's been out for a couple weeks. And when you get your hands on a copy, which you can buy from your local bookstore, I have a link in the notes if you want to buy it through bookshop.org. If you use that link, then a little bit of money goes to support this podcast. And I also have a link on there now for if you buy through Bookshop for UK, then also I have a way that supports the show too. But also, I'm a big proponent of using your local public library, get your name on that holds list or borrow it if it's on the shelf. If your local public library doesn't own the book, I have to say as a library insider, every library has some way that you can suggest books for them to buy. So just go to your library's website. Somewhere there's going to be like a contact us page and just message them and say, please buy The Tower by Flora Carr. And libraries take those requests seriously, is what I have to say. It's such a vulgar history coded book. I mean, I'll say now, this isn't a spoiler because this is in all the promotional materials about it, but I will say there is a lesbian romance in this book. So anyway, we're talking about that book all month. I'm posting questions every Wednesday, like discussion threads basically on Instagram every Wednesday and on Patreon every Saturday. And the book club on Patreon is free, so you don't need to become a paid member. You just need to become, I guess, a free member of Patreon to be able to comment there. But I also wanted to let you know, next week, I'm going to be recording a second follow-up interview with Flora Carr, author of The Tower, where I'm going to be asking just spoiler-filled questions. We're going to have a spoiler-filled conversation. I'm recording it next week and it comes out the week after. But I'm telling you this now because the discussion question this week on both Patreon and on Instagram is what questions do you have for Flora Carr? So let me know what you want me to ask her. Or on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. And then you can get to the book club. I guess the quickest way to get to the book club is if you go to vulgarhistory.com/book club. All these links are in the show notes, so you can get there as well. And I also wanted to mention, speaking of the Patreon, so Patreon is my place where you can support me in the podcast, and in return, I give you some access to exclusive things. So if you support the podcast on Patreon, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter for at least $1 Canadian a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes of this podcast, including past episodes. And then for $5 or more a month, monthly pledge, you get access to bonus episodes of Vulgar Peace Theater, where I talk about costume dramas with Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. Most recently, we talked about the Brotherhood of the Wolf. We've also talked about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and other movies, Queen Margot, A Knight's Tale, Tombstone, various things. And also that's where episodes of So This Asshole are available, like now available. So This Asshole, John Knox, which was several months ago when the Patreon membership was getting close to 500. I promised that if I got at least 500 followers on Patreon, I would do So This Asshole, John Knox, and I have reached that target. And I have recorded an episode about John Knox, and it might surprise you. There are some moments where I empathize with him, and there are some moments where I just call him trash, and at the end I have to give him a score. Anyway, so you can listen to that if you become a $5 a month subscriber on Patreon, but also I'm making all these, like from now on, all these exclusive episodes. You can also just buy it. So if you want to just listen to just So This Asshole, John Knox without becoming a Patreon member, you can just buy that for $5 Canadian on patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. And I also want to mention our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry, which is 100% woman-owned business using recycled gold to make beautiful pendants and rings and jewelry, all with images of fabulous women from history, mostly classical history, as well as women from mythology. So there's like Medusa, but there's also like Cleopatra, Boudica. Anne Boleyn is She mostly does. That's why I said mostly classical era, but Anne Boleyn is there as well. She has a whole collection called the Difficult Women collection, which is just women who have been seen in the past as difficult, and now we would call them tits out, basically. These pieces are available in solid gold as well as in more affordable gold vermeil. And Vulgar History listeners can always get 15% off all items from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. That's commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. We also have Vulgar History merchandise available at vulgarhistory.com/store. Or if you're outside the US, you can shop at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And I'm always happy to hear from you. You can send me a message where I'm on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod, or you can use the form at vulgarhistory.com to message me, or just email me directly at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com with suggestions of people you think would be good subjects for the podcast, or if you have thoughts or opinions on episodes or whatever, feel free to do that. Actually, if you have thoughts and opinions about episodes that are positive, you can always feel free to please post those thoughts and opinions on Apple Podcasts and leave a nice little review. Like, you tap on the 5 stars and you can just write like, "This is a great podcast," or whatever. I really appreciate those reviews. Sometimes I get mean ones, and it's nice to counterbalance that with nice ones from people who have listened to this much of the podcast and are still listening to these, like, after the episode discussion points. Transcripts of recent episodes are available at vulgarhistory.com. Thank you to Evelyn Malik for providing these transcripts. Next week, we're going to be dipping into South American culture. We're going to be talking about a legendary figure from the history of Chile. And I was really excited to find a person to bring on to talk to about this. And we had such a really good, very lengthy conversation. And that's what's going to be coming up here next week. But at the meantime, please post or just share with me, or whatever, message me like your questions for Flora Carr about the tower. I hope you're all reading it. I hope you're all loving it. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Murachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Contained herein are the heresies of Redolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Redolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Subscribe to the Ghost Story Guys now on your favorite podcatcher to hear episodes like High Strangeness in Chicago, The Mystery of Missing Time, and The Haunting of Vietnam, along with dozens of others.
We've talked about mythical bridges, doppelgangers, haunted seaside towns, and so much more.
Remember that story about the guy who was trapped inside a dream and something was hunting him? That was upsetting.
Yes it was.
Want us to help ruin your sleep? Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.